A 1, 2, 3, 4.
Oh, hello.
Welcome, friends of the show. We are back with another episode of the Serious Rock Talk podcast.
Ooh, all right.
A big thanks for your emails, suggestions, and your support on our social media platforms. Continue to email us at seriousrocktalk@gmail.com. Find us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Okay, buckle up for some serious rock talk.
Hello, this is Ian Clarke from Serious Rock Talk Podcast. Today's podcast is special. As our listeners know, I have a special affinity for pop songs from the late 50s and early 60s. I've often thought the great music of those artists, people like Bobby Darin, Bo Diddley, Dion, Carole King, Dick Dale, and a lot of the so-called girl groups got unfairly smothered out by the Beatles and the whole mid to late 60s phenomena, the Woodstock generation. That is why I am so pleased today to be speaking with Richard Aquila. Among other books, Richard is the author of the recently published Rock and Roll in Kennedy's America, A Cultural History of the Early 1960s. It is published by John Hopkins University Press. Richard is a professor emeritus of history and American studies at Penn State University and the former host of NPR's Rock and Roll America. Richard, I've read your new book cover to cover, and it is wonderful, and I welcome you to the podcast today. So why don't
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. It was just a great read. You know, simultaneously, I was reading a book about girl groups from that period, and it was a nice meshing. This book I was reading, I can't recall the author, just focuses on girl groups, and I had no idea there were so many in such a short amount of time. It's just a strange period in music for me. Anyway, the first question I want to get to is we can begin by discovering the background on the book. Obviously, a book like this requires massive amounts of research, and in your case, a roster of unique interviews, which you listed in the back of the book. So what inspired you to undertake a large-scale work?
Well, several things, I think. One of the things is my own personal background, that I basically grew up with rock and roll. I was there when the music was born in the 1950s. It served as a soundtrack for my high school years,
right.
And I witnessed the changes that occurred after in 1963 when the Beatles and the British rock invasion hit, and really dramatically changes the trajectory of the music. And I experienced, in effect, how the music changed with the times, and that always struck me from the very beginning, how important the music was to the kids growing up during those years. And then later on, when I went to college and majored in history and later went on for a PhD, it all started coming together in the sense that historians were talking about history from the grassroots,
right.
From the bottom up.
Right.
And yet not very many people looked at rock and roll and took it seriously. And what occurred to me is something that I had always knew intuitively, that the music was extremely important to people. It was part of the cultural backdrop for them. And what I wanted to do with this book, essentially, is to try to get at that, always asking that question, what does the music tell you about the times? What does it reflect in terms of what's going on? And so what came together, in effect, was my personal interest in the music, as well as my professional ones too. And then on top of that, it seemed that particular time period between 1960 and 1963 kind of got lost in what had happened. Because remember American Pie, Don McLean's
sure.
hit in 1971.
I remember when it came out.
The music died.
Right.
That becomes part of the mythology in terms of rock and roll, that many people think that after that plane crash where Buddy Holly and Ritchie Valens and the Big Bopper died tragically in 1959, that the music just sort of expired with them. And it wasn't until the Beatles came along that it reinvigorates the music. And when you start looking at the songs from that time period, you realize it just wasn't true. I mean, this was great music. Anybody who knew and listened to the radio during that time period understood it was great music. And I wanted to essentially get at it from that perspective.
Going along with that, I do enjoy the importance you place in the role of history influencing pop culture and, in turn, pop music. Because so many books on art that I've read underplay the role of politics on art, as if art is not a reactive pursuit and can only be conducted within the privacy of a fortress, what have you. In the early 60s in America, what do you see as some of the biggest influences on pop music? What created those types of upbeat, innocent-sounding songs?
That's a very interesting question. What it is, I think, is a combination of factors, some of which are mainstream political.
Okay.
In terms of rock and roll was born in the midst of this Cold War in the 1950s and in the early 1960s, and the music's going to pick up on a lot of those Cold War themes. What we find is, if you start looking at these songs in the 1950s and the early 60s, the general notion is rock and roll was rebellious, particularly in the 1950s.
Right.
And what we find is, when you look at the music from that time period, from the 50s all the way through the early 1960s, there are elements of rebellion in it. There's no question about that. But far more obvious are some of the things that reflect that Cold War culture of the 1950s and early 60s. Patriotism, what's going on with religion during those years and everything else, the consensus behavior of that Cold War culture. And this music's going to reflect that. So I think that's one major ingredient. And then here comes John F. Kennedy, elected to the presidency in 1960, and Kennedy coming on the heels of Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower is the oldest American president at that point. Kennedy is the youngest elected one in 1960, only 43 years old. And Kennedy had great hairdo, didn't wear hats because he wanted to mess up his hair, always was oriented toward youth, and American kids picked up on that too. So politics plays a major role in terms of what's going on. And another very important ingredient is simply the sheer number of baby boomers that are born in the years after World War II. And those kids are going to, by the late 1950s and early 1960s, they are going to cause the music industry to tip in the direction of youth, just like a lot of other things going on within the culture. And record companies are going to realize that that's where a lot of the sales are, particularly after the payola scale hits in 1960. So I think all these ingredients are coming together to really emphasize the importance of this music during those years.
As I was thinking about your book last week, by chance I saw a documentary about the making of the film American Graffiti, a film set in California in 1962. And it's known for having this, maybe it was the first time it was done, a soundtrack of songs from the period running continuously throughout the film. So you have songs like Teen Angel, Runaway, Surfin' Safari, Peppermint Twist, Barbara Ann. However, there's a poignancy to that film, for we know by the end that this Disneyland of cruising cars and surf music can't last. So we can look at what gave rise to rock and roll, and you've just given us some great examples in Kennedy's America. But what shut it down somewhat abruptly? It wasn't just the Beatles, whose first songs were so innocent themselves, I Want to Hold Your Hand. What was the confluence in 1964 that really, I think, quickly just dissipated what had built up over the 2 or 3 years?
The tipping point that I think that we really have to look at is Kennedy's assassination on November 22nd, 1963.
Okay.
And what you find, and I mentioned this in the book too, that in early 1963, the Beatles already were making it big in the UK and also on the European continent. And the Beatles tried to crack into the American market in early 1963. And Dick Clarke on American Bandstand,
Right.
one of the top watch programs in the United States in the early 1960s, in the late 50s and early 60s, Clarke used to run a segment in the show called Rate a Record, where teenagers from the audience, 3 or 4 of them, would sit down as a panel. Clarke would introduce a new record and play it for the kids, and the kids would rate the record. And in this particular case, in early 1963, one of Clarke's very close friends, Bernie Binnick, who owned Swan Records, which was a Philadelphia-based label, Binnick approached Clarke and said, look, we have worked out this deal with this group that looks like they got a lot of potential called the Beatles. And Clarke does a double take, the Beatles, what kind of name is that? and Binnick says, let me explain. This group is causing lots of commotion in England. People love them. We have an exclusive on the Beatles with one of their records that if we could sell 50,000 copies of this record in 4 months, we get a permanent control over all Beatle releases in the United States. And Binnick said, could you at least give it a shot on American Bandstand on Rate a Record? And Clarke, as a friend, said, okay, sure, we'll give it a shot. So Clarke plays the song.
Right.
The teenagers there, the 4 teenagers on the panel, after it was over with, absolutely, some of them hated it. Others thought, what is this stuff? We don't like it at all. And by the way, the name of the song is She Loves You.
Oh, no.
And these kids, they really tore into that song. So we don't like the harmonies. The sound is weird, and we just don't like that. And the average score was a 73. Now, for other songs that they loved, it could be in the high 90s, and they'd say, oh, it's got a great beat you could dance to and everything else.
Right.
But in this particular case, they panned it. And now this is in early 1963.
Oh, boy.
After the Beatles hit, a couple of weeks after the death of John F. Kennedy, the Beatles are going to hit it really big, obviously, in early 1964. And Dick Clarke went back and he was talking to Bernie Binnick and said, Bernie, you had an exclusive. Why didn't you just buy 50,000 copies yourself? And Binnick just shook his head and he said, you panned it on American Bandstand. The kids hated it. We thought we had a stiff, so we didn't promote it at all, and we lost our exclusive deal.
I remember reading that in your book. That's a great story.
Yeah, and I think that really says something in terms of what changed in those several months. And what changes, I think, Ian, is the assassination of Kennedy.
Okay.
That absolutely shakes America to its foundation in some ways, including American teenagers. For the first time, many of those kids are experiencing death, and not only death in that sense, but here is this larger-than-life figure, John F. Kennedy, and no one believed that the President of the United States would be assassinated. That was, unfortunately, those kinds of things happen far too often now in terms of those types of deaths in the United States and elsewhere.
Right.
But back then, you had to go back to William McKinley at the turn of the century, as far as an assassination, and then prior to that, Abraham Lincoln. It just wasn't something that happened in the mid-20th century. That was ancient history. And things change rapidly. And Ian, you really hit it on the head when you said it does change in terms of the music, because as I was going back and doing this book, I went back and looked at many of the artists on the American charts who dominated, people like Brenda Lee,
Oh, yeah.
Roy Orbison, Gene Pitney. I mean, lots of big stars who were dominating in the early 1960s. All of a sudden, they couldn't buy a hit after 1963. They had 40 top 10 hits prior to the death of Kennedy, and then after Kennedy's death, it's like somebody's flicked the switch, and no longer could they even score, because now everybody wanted something that was not American music.
Oh, I see. I see what you're going at. Yeah. And the other thing that
It was giving them a new identity.
It's a new identity,
basically,
and the reaction. You think the Surfing Safari is just 2 years away from Buffalo Springfield, from what it's worth. Radically different songs about Really? But
Sure.
I mean, less than 3 years. What happened? You go back in Sinatra's career or Tony Bennett, any of these guys, they didn't switch like that. But rock and roll is so reactive, and that's been my experience over the last decades, kind of following and talking about it. It's very sensitive to what's happening in politics.
Sure. And I think something else is going on too, and that is it relates to two things. One of the things is the reason why I focused on the early 60s is because in some ways it is overshadowed by what comes later. Because when we think about rock music making a political statement,
right,
lots of the groups that you're talking about pop into mind that become very popular in 66, 67, 68, 69, and so forth, where the music does become more political, explicitly political. And
right.
What dawned on me was, again, as an historian looking at this, the music was every bit as political, but it was more subtle in the early 60s and
right.
the late 1950s in most cases. But it still was there when you take a look at, like I do in the book when I'm talking about how the music reflects the times, what you're talking about is the music is expressing the beliefs of that young culture. And then I think the second ingredient that I would add to that is back in the early 60s and in the late 1950s, one of the key components in terms of popularizing rock and roll is going to be top 40 radio.
Right.
And then American Bandstand is kind of an extension of that on television. But with top 40 radio, kids are listening, regardless of where they lived in the United States, they're basically listening to the same songs over and over again. And
right.
It's becoming ingrained in that collective consciousness of that baby boom generation that's growing up during those years and hitting high school for the first time in 1960, just when Kennedy becomes president. And those songs become part of the collective memory of that generation. And to this day, a lot of those kids from back then who are now in their late 60s and 70s, and in some cases beyond, they know those songs.
Oh, yeah. The oldies tours are strong.
And it tells you something about that in terms of they're all listening to the same kind of stuff, and that song, in many cases, is expressing what their feelings are like, and it's kind of a two-way street, that it's the music's reflecting what's going on in that culture, but the music's also shaping it, too. In a sense, because kids will go out and learn how to twist because that becomes one of the popular hits of the early 1960s. So it really is a two-way street, and it's extremely important from that perspective because we're not just talking about ephemeral music that disappears, but we're talking about something that becomes part of the American songbook, too.
It's a great point.
And while I'm at it, in fact, when I mentioned American songbook, let me toss one other thing in that I think is really important, too. That most people don't realize now because music is so diverse. But back then, prior to the Beatles hitting, 99% of the people making those charts during those years, the Billboard charts,
right,
were born and raised in the United States.
Oh, interesting.
And this represents his Cold War mentality back then, too, I think, because the notion was rock and roll was an American idiom. Rock and roll, in order to really sing it, you had to be an American. And if anybody who was not an American tried to sing it, people didn't want to listen. It was not considered to be as good. Now, look how quickly that changes after Kennedy's death, where after that, it's almost like if you were an American, you had a harder time making those charts.
I remember,
something's going on there.
Some guys used to put on, I think it was Paul Revere and the Raiders, people used to put on English accents to get accepted. That's how bad it was.
Oh, sure.
Well, you kind of covered one of my other questions. I was going to talk about the role of technology, radio and TV, in promoting rock in that period, because throughout your book, I do see the name Dick Clarke pop up, and I do see the name Ed Sullivan pop up. And I know that radio was influential in Sinatra's career. He once said, no radio, no Sinatra. So from what you've said so far, TV and radio, and the way radio was played with Top 40, which I clearly remember, made songs of the time popular and a soundtrack to the lives of the people who lived there.
Yeah, I mean, even going back to, you mentioned American Graffiti earlier.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why that was such a powerful movie for many people during that time period is because it really does tap into that connection between that youth culture in 1962 and those songs that were constantly being played. Regardless of whether you were driving that car up and down the strip like in that movie, or whether you went to a record hop, or wherever you listened to music in in your bedroom late at night, those were the songs that you were listening to. So from that perspective, it plays an extremely important role in terms of what's going on.
Yeah, and I tell my kids that even back then, we had to put up with 10 songs we didn't really like to hear that one song that we did. Hence, you had a very wide parameter of understanding of pop music at that time. We couldn't stream anything. So as a result, I discovered all these groups that were pretty good. But initially,
sure.
That's the way it worked.
Yeah, and also the other thing here, too, and as I was writing this book, the more I got into it, the more I realized, whoa, what am I doing here? Because there's so much that's being heard there on Top 40. And it's all sort of grouped under this umbrella of rock and roll, but it really isn't in many ways, because what you're looking at is even the rise of popular folk music during that time period, coming of Peter, Paul, and Mary and the Kingston Trio and groups like that. I mean, they were also being applauded by that rock and roll audience. Those kids are listening to all these different songs on Top 40, regardless of whether it's folk music or regardless of whether it's Steve Lawrence singing songs like Pretty Blue Eyes or Footsteps, which come out of the Brill Building. I mean, all of these things are being listened to. And it was a much more eclectic sound for teenagers during those years. It's not like today where kids can stream and they listen to one type of music and everything else. Back then, again, it's more of a general approach. And it's one of those things that ties Americans together. And I've noticed, and again, as an historian, I play with all sorts of ideas along these lines.
Right.
But one of the questions I always used to ask a question in my class sometimes when we're dealing with U.S. social and cultural history is I would pose the question, what is an American? Picking up on an idea that dates back to the 1700s when it was first asked by individuals. And it's been interesting because slowly but surely along the way, what has happened over the last 100 or so years is a lot of the things that used to draw people together into an American identity, those kinds of things, one by one, have fallen by the wayside. And very few things now are joining together in terms of Americans. The Super Bowl that just occurred recently.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
It's a really good example because it's one of the few things now that Americans are watching at the same time on television, because usually now people are splintered based on cable and streaming and everything else in terms of what they're watching. And it kind of poses an interesting question, I think, and that is, given how things have changed in terms of the technology, could you even have a group like the Beatles again or Elvis Presley?
That's a wonderful,
commanding the attention of everybody.
It's really a great. Recently, I heard McCartney say, "No, you couldn't have that." He said, "There's too many events cross paths, too many vectors cross, so to speak. You couldn't have the Beatles again because everything back then was perfect for, like as you said, Kennedy's death and the emergence of electric instruments and everything came across. But no, I don't think you could have the Beatles again. And there's this polarization. It's there, and it's there with the music too. And music is kind of a cement. It does bring people. It is a soundtrack of their lives in many ways. I remember 10 years ago, I don't know how I found myself there, but I saw an oldies tour with Fabian and Frankie Avalon. And I looked around the crowd, and there were people much older than me, people in their late 70s at that time. It was very important to them. All these great Connie Francis songs from that period. And some of them were pretty hokey, but it was special to them, right? That was their, that was their lifeblood. Another question I have, in your book, How 1950s America Created Elvis and the Rock and Roll Craze, you write, quote, rock and roll's close ties to its audience make it a valuable source of history. These sonic snapshots, by the way, that's a term I love, sonic snapshots. That should be your next book. From the 1950s, provide new perspectives on political, social, cultural, and economic trends of the day, unquote. I would assume we can say the same about rock and roll in the Kennedy years. We can transfer those characteristics to the Kennedy years. Political, social, cultural.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, and economic, sure.
Yeah, I mean, what you're looking at from the early 1960s is, and again, this kind of ties in with what I said earlier about how post-Beatles, things become much more obvious in terms of the politics,
You're right.
Anti-Vietnam, and the changes going on in civil rights and everything like that. But what's going on in the early 1960s is equally fascinating, because what you see during that time period is the music reflects not just the booming economy, as teenagers are going out and they're buying all these records and rock and roll styles and everything else. I think of car songs and things like that.
Yeah.
But also, it really does say something about the blossoming civil rights movement in the early 1960s.
Sure.
Rock and roll of the early 60s is intertwined with the civil rights movement. Just to give you an example, being specific about this, what we're looking at is in 1960, the African-American population of the United States was approximately 11%.
Okay.
That's in 1960. At the same time, if you take a look at the pop charts, mostly rock and roll artists we're talking about, 30% of all of the hits on those top 40 charts in 1960 were done by black artists.
Wow.
By 1963, it rises to 36% of all those hits are being done by black artists. And what that seems to suggest is rock and roll basically is picking up on the other trends going on in the United States, and there are more and more opportunities for black artists during that time period. Same thing is true with women as well, that what you're looking at is a rise in the number of women singers in the early 1960s. You mentioned girl groups, and clearly that's one very important aspect of this, but you also have single artists as well who are making the charts consistently during the early 60s, from people like Connie Francis to later on in 1963, Leslie Gore.
Oh, sure.
Little Piggy March is another one.
Right.
I mean, so those kinds of changes are being reflected in the music that's happening. And again, it's not just reflecting it, but if you take a look at Leslie Gore, the song "You Don't Own Me," certainly is shaping women's attitudes as well. And it says something about the rising feminism. I don't want to argue early 60s rock and roll is feminist, because technically, no, it's not. But you see changes going on during those years, and I find it far more than coincidental that you have a book like The Feminine Mystique coming out in 1963.
That's right.
And that's the same year that Leslie Gore is recording her hit.
Oh, that's nice.
They're both click moments for women during those years. So, yeah, the music is really plugging into everything that's going on during that time period.
Well, it's great because your book brought that to light for me, and I probably skimmed that somewhere in my subconscious, but when I read this, I thought, and I was reading the Motown input too, and I thought, okay, that makes sense, because Motown's always been a bit out in left field for me. I was always trying to figure out how they got started in Detroit and worked themselves up and making those wonderful, Lamont Dozier hits, and that's part of it too, right? So yes, kind of a sidebar on it, but it's part of it too. But your book brought that to light. So I won't keep you, Richard. On behalf of the podcast, I want to thank you for your time today. And I really do, that you are inspired to write more great books about music that I love. And I want to thank you so much for that.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure. It was wonderful talking to you.
Oh, great. Well, thanks very much. Have a wonderful morning.
Okay, you too, Ian.
All right, Richard. Bye-bye.
Bye.